We are going to continue on in our Unapologetics class. We've been looking at a few subjects the last several weeks. We've been trying to make some classical arguments, and I want to see if you guys remember what they are. The cosmological argument. And what is the cosmological argument? Yes, based on creation. Keep going. What else? We got a teleological argument, like the fine-tuning argument. Great. What else? Anything else? The moral argument we looked at last week. And what we'd like to do tonight, before we jump in, we're going to be talking about the psychology of unbelief, which is, I think, an important subject to discuss. And I think you'll see why as we get into it. We'll next week we were going to get into science and knowledge tonight, so we were going to talk a little bit about epistemology this evening. But I think we'll punt that till next week for a variety of reasons, not least of which I want to kind of keep things consistent with the theme of the night. But before we get into actually talking about the psychology of unbelief, I thought we would discuss one more argument that I think is a good argument for us to talk about. I mean, by the way, let me just say, there's many ways in which you can offer up arguments and syllogisms for the evidences of God's existence. And you've been hearing me say each week that more often than not, those arguments are not going to get you to the Christian God. They're not going to get you to Jesus. But there are ways in which you can help yourself become best prepared or better prepared to engage in conversations with people that might ask legitimate questions. They really want to know, well, what do you think about this? Or how do you think things came to be? What is your idea about evolution? And it's important for us to be able to have some credible responses so that we're offering a justifiable faith to them. It's not just a faith that we adopted from our grandma and grandpa. It is not just something that we sense intrinsically, but it's something that we actually think is coherent logically. And so that's where some of these arguments come from. And the reason why I started the first 5 of our 15 sessions on this seminar with these arguments is it's important in any apologetics class. This is probably what you're going to get. You're going to get some of the classical arguments, and then you'll begin to work through maybe more modern arguments for the existence of God. But in this grouping is not usually included what we're about to hear, but I think is very important, which is the argument for God from consciousness. And we have a dear brother who is in our church, Dave, that is going to come up and talk to us, who happens to be a neurosurgeon. And we thought it would be good to hear his perspective as a neurosurgeon on this subject. So would everybody welcome Dave, please?
Sideways, I'll have to turn it back on again. That's okay. Yeah. Come on. Come on. All right. Put this down for a second. So what I'm going to talk about is where neuroscience came from as a materialistic explanation for how the brain works and consciousness. I'm going to talk about the history of it, what we know at this point, what we don't know at this point, and some common arguments concerning consciousness, theories concerning consciousness, and where they fall short. First, the Greeks did the first brain dissections, and they kind of got off on the wrong foot, no pun intended. Aristotle was a very opinionated person, and he thought he knew everything. He knew nothing about anatomy, but he had a theory that the soul and the mind were centered in the heart. The brain was a radiator to cool down the heart. So he kind of missed there. Modern neuroscience actually began in the Renaissance with the great anatomists such as Da Vinci and Vesalius, who first described the actual structures of the brain. Then in the 17th century, Thomas Willis described the vasculature around the brain. Now in the late 18th and into the 19th century, physicians were applying a medical model of pattern recognition to illnesses. They would see a set of symptoms, a set of signs, and say, I think I know that these are coming from a particular organ or a particular part of an organ. And so eventually they tried to apply this to the brain. And neurology became a distinct discipline, trying to figure out our behaviors, how our brain worked based on these pattern recognitions, what particular parts of the brain were having a problem, and then psychiatry also developed as a sister discipline. So basically, it's a look at symptoms to elucidate where the problem is. And these documented patterns of symptoms and findings were known as syndromes. They're groups of behaviors, symptoms, physical findings that are seen commonly together in patients that have a particular problem in a particular area. A classic syndrome that we often talk about and teach early in medical school is called frontal lobe syndrome, and it's seen in patients with dominant frontal lobe damage. It was first described by a gentleman by the name of Harlow, and it was in reference to a patient named Phineas Gage back in 1848. Now, Mr. Gage had an unfortunate encounter with a large iron bar which went through his frontal lobe. He survived it, but he had some very strange behaviors afterwards, and these included a loss of motivation and self-direction in activities, apathy, poor judgment, inappropriate behavior and lack of social awareness, poor impulse control, angry outbursts, rigidity and stiffness of gait, and urinary incontinence. Now, I actually had a patient who had a severe frontal lobe syndrome. I saw him, he was in his mid-60s, he was a retired Army NCO, and over the space of a few years, he developed symptoms that began with outbursts of inappropriate behavior and anger with his wife to the point where he was actually physically abusive of her. Then, over another period of time, he started to become less and less driven to do things. He couldn't do his daily activities without significant direction. He became very apathetic about life to the point where he basically just sat around all the time. But he stopped abusing his wife, so his wife wasn't too concerned at that point. However, when he started to urinate on himself, then she got concerned. She took him to a physician for an evaluation because she thought he was demented. Okay? Lo and behold, he got a CT scan which demonstrated a lesion about the size of a tennis ball on the roof of his orbits, pushing up on his frontal lobes, with considerable pressure and edema. I saw him as a neurosurgeon remove the lesion. It was a pretty rocky start afterwards because of all the swelling and edema he had. But within several months, he actually regained almost all of his normal functions. He was able to actually drive himself, by himself, all the way from El Paso, where we were at the time, to Philadelphia to visit friends. And the good news is, he never went back to abusing his wife. Now, in the 20th century, we started to get a little bit more scientific. Started to look at the microscopic anatomy. As histology and microanatomy developed, physicians such as Cajal looked at the actual cells in the brain and discovered, lo and behold, not only were there lots of cells, but there were all kinds of different cells with very complicated connections and very complicated tracks. There also was the knowledge or the revelation that the brain had electrical activity in it. Just as the heart has electrical activity you can measure on an EKG, they discovered the brain has electrical activity as well, which is manifested by the EEG. They developed imaging studies based on the X-rays, started out with just plain skull X-rays, then pneumoencephalograms where they injected air into the spinal column, into the dural sac, and then moved it around the brain to try to see mass lesions. Angiography was very common at that time, and ultimately developed CT scan and MRI when computer technology allowed that to be developed. There also was increased understanding about neuroembryology and how the developing nervous system forms. Now, late in the 20th century and on to the 21st century, neurophysiology and cellular biology actually looked at the individual cells in the brain, how they functioned, how receptors worked, how neurotransmitters worked, how they were able to conduct electrical signals back and forth and communicate with each other and form very complicated patterns. And then ultimately, particular studies called PET scans and functional MRI were developed, which were able to actually look at physiologic changes that were occurring when a particular activity was being performed. Through all this, we were able to really understand pretty well some pathways and functions in the brain. For instance, we have a good idea of how the sensory pathways work: vision, hearing, touch, how the motor pathways work, how balance and coordination work, how speech works, how the reticular activating system keeps you aware and alert and is able to look for danger for you. But we have some significant problems with other parts of the brain. We know the hippocampus is important for placing memories into the brain. But we really don't know how they're stored. There are multiple theories, but none of them has been proven to be correct at this point. We know that the limbic system and the amygdala is very important for you to develop emotions. I'm sure you've all heard of the hypothalamus and the autonomic nervous system and the quote-unquote fight or flight response. Well, that comes from the limbic system through the hypothalamus, through the autonomic nervous system. But what about more complicated emotions? What about the love of a parent for a child? What about appreciation of beauty or the awe and reverence of God? You can't really explain that in that circumstance. What about free will? If you believe there is free will, by the way. I'm not trying to point any fingers. But how can we explain free will for purely mechanical, mechanistic, and material explanation? Basically, if I'm only the sum of my anatomy and my function, how can I possibly be held responsible morally for any event that occurs? I'm just a product of what has happened to me. And if I knew all the details well enough of somebody's brain, I could completely predict every one of their activities. Now, we all know that's not true. Something seems to be missing there. Now, materialists will argue that, well, free will is explained by the phenomenon of quantum mechanics, the variability in existence. But if that were the case, if quantum mechanics was a pure explanation, why is my brain so organized? Well, maybe your brain's. Why is the brain so organized? Okay? Why does it always seem to develop patterns? It doesn't make a lot of sense if things are that random. What about conscience? Where does conscience come in? It seems that the idea of conscience, which resists my natural urges and impulses for activities that are beneficial to me, doesn't seem like a very good survival benefit. There's also neuroplasticity. The nervous system has incredibly limited ability to repair cells or to repair damage, or it can't even replace cells. Why then do we see damaged patients recover, especially young patients, children, have remarkable recoveries at times from very extensive damage? Because they're able to bypass things from a neuroplasticity perspective, and it doesn't really explain itself well when applying a materialistic approach to it. Now, the other thing you have to remember about neuroscience is it's basically looking at observations of structures, behaviors, and physiologic events. It has nothing to do with thought. We all have thoughts. We all have a subjective experience of thinking. I can't read your mind. No neuroscientist can read your mind. Your mind is a mystery as far as your thought process. Same thing will eventually come up with AI and artificial intelligence. All we can say about artificial intelligence is it's behaving the way we think it should based upon it thinking. But is there any real experience of thought occurring? So there are four basic schools of thought about what consciousness is. There's the basic materialist school. We understand it. You know, we've talked about all these processes, we've got it wired, we know what's going on, we can explain it all, and the subjective experience you have of thought is meaningless. Or it's just a happy accident of evolution. Okay? That position is becoming a lot less popular because it just seems so incomplete. Then you have progressive materialism. We've learned so much about the way the brain works. Just give us time and have faith. We'll figure it all out eventually. Probably not. Then we have expanded materialism, or what's also called panpsychism. And this is based on the blurring of matter and energy that we see in modern physics. Energy can be matter, matter can be energy. The two are almost interchangeable. Well, the panpsychic people add a third category, consciousness. They ascribe consciousness to everything. That chair, this floor I'm standing on, even me. And that individual consciousness occurs at a subatomic level and actually sustains and helps produce reality. To my mind, that sounds like pantheism or New Age mysticism. And I don't think it's a very good explanation for anything from that perspective. The final explanation is probably the least popular and one that this audience probably likes, dualism. the basic idea that there is a spiritual, immaterial part of existence, and then the material part of existence. And like I said, since scientists are basically materialists, by and large, their thoughts on dualism are usually poo-pooing it. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. Any questions?
Ask away, please.
Not too complicated, though. Yes?
So I had a conversation the other day with a really smart guy who was telling me how he thought that AI was going to, that consciousness was going to emerge from AI. Does that then fall into this panpsychism? Is that why, does that sort of indicate that that's where he's thinking, this panpsychist sort of perspective?
That may be part of it, but again, when it comes down to it, neuroscience doesn't measure consciousness. All we do is look at the manifestations of consciousness. There's no real way that we can look at the subjective experience that we all have, and we all know that we have, of consciousness from a neuroscientist's perspective. There's no way to read a mind.
Dave, how would you articulate what consciousness is?
Well, consciousness is basically, it's your awareness of your environment, your alertness level of your environment, the ability to process information, for instance, to have sensory input, to be able to interact with the environment, to be able to access or make memories, and also there's an emotional content as well. So those are the basic features of consciousness.
And why is it such a difficulty if you're kind of in a closed system of just scientific naturalism? Why does it feel like such a mystery for just pure materialists to explain consciousness?
I think what it comes down to is the subjective experience of consciousness that we all have. We all have it, we know it exists, and when somebody says, I can explain it based on material explanations only, it just falls short.
I mean, this isn't brain.
It isn't brain surgery, no.
Everybody give Dave a round of applause. Thank you, my friend.
Sir,
Appreciate
no
that.
problem.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful thing to recognize that there's, and we're going to talk again more about this next week, but just how much science is helpful to the Christian. I mean, I know why historically there's been this war between science and religion, or science and faith, or science and Christianity, but it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful servant to us to help us understand the complexity of the world in which we live. And it does feel like, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Dave, but it does feel like the more we dig into the biological sciences, the more we consider physics, the more problematic the old answers become. The answers that were just taught 50, even 100 years ago just seem almost sophomoric at this point. They don't seem to have the explanatory power that we once thought that they did. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to what we were talking about the first night. You get to that beginning, the Big Bang, the event, whatever creation myth you or idea you want to use. And looking beyond that, science cannot see. You basically get to the beginning, but what was before the beginning?
Yeah.
Same thing with the mind.
And there's some interesting category errors that I think take place as well that, again, we'll get into next week, but maybe by way of preview. That it's important to understand that science has a beautiful place in our world. I mean, it is, any Christian that is against empiricism is really not thinking through just how wonderful God's common grace is in His world. That we have, in many ways, explored creation. We've, on some level, harnessed creation, and that has been at times for ill, but often for good. And the problem, I think, arises when, especially people that are committed to scientific naturalism, try to leap beyond what science is intended to do and try to answer metaphysical, philosophical, or theological questions. They become category errors. They're arguing for things and about things that is not their area of expertise. And it's, so when you read Dennett and Dawkins and even would hear Hitchens, Hitchens is probably more philosophically astute, but some of the more new atheists, I think the challenges for people that understand or have been trained a little bit in philosophy are so monumental that the book reviews that would often be written on these books, even in the New York Times book review, they would just shatter the books because they're sound scientifically, but they're not sound philosophically, and they're certainly they don't make great arguments theologically. And so that doesn't mean anything other than to say it's important that we understand when we take something that is a good and we try to extrapolate it out to be the ultimate answer for all things, it's going to break down. In the same way that me as a pastor, me who's interested, has maybe a bit of an interest background in philosophy, for me to jump into the operating room with Dave would go horribly wrong if you were the patient, would it not? You would want me to pray for you.
Don't poke the brain.
Don't poke the brain. Like, oh, that moves. Oh, that moves. Yeah, you'd want me to pray for you before and after. Maybe you'd want me to be there in case anything went wrong so I could pray. But you don't want me picking up a scalpel, right? That's not my area of expertise. That is far beyond my pay grade. And so it is with science and knowledge and knowing and ultimate questions. And that's really what we've been looking at these last few weeks, is we've been asking ultimate questions. I became fascinated with some of these questions early on as a Christian, probably because I came out of a background it was not just atheist, but was kind of anti-theist. I was very upset at the God that didn't exist. When I became a Christian, it was an interesting time of my life. I also had left a big company that I was working for, and I started my own company. And I moved from working in accounting and finance, which was my job, was to essentially help organize departments and then bring in CFOs and VPs of finance to ensure that the company was flourishing financially. I decided to leap into biotechnology and service biotech companies. And so startup companies would get started by way of investment through venture capital firms. We would work with the venture capitalists. They would have scientists that would make a proposal to the VC firms. Those VC firms would think, hey, this might be good research, and we might make money off it. Maybe a drug will hit or something like that. So they would start these companies, and they would bring us in to essentially organize and start the companies. And I would then have to go around the world and look for chief scientific officers, VPs of pharmacokinetics, molecular biologists, things like that. And part of the incubation process of a company moving from idea into existence would often mean that those scientists, those early scientists, didn't have an office, so they'd meet in our office. We would have these amazing conversations. I mean, I cut my teeth in so many ways in apologetics. Just in that, there was a conference room that they would have, and they would set up in our conference room. There would usually be no more than 5 at a time, because once we got beyond that size of recruiting those scientists in, we'd get them their own building. But they would just have these incredible conversations around lunchtime. We'd bring lunch in. The partner that I started this company with was a Christian himself. He was about 20 years older than me, and we would just it was fascinating. But I learned something early on, something that is still a great reminder for me, that you can be an expert in a field of knowledge and drill down 3 miles and have absolutely no width to your base of knowledge. And what I discovered in many of those conversations, and this is in no way a knock on intelligence or capabilities, but you just learn that there's a whole world of questions out there that when you are that bright, when you're the top 1 to 3%, which is kind of the scientists that we always went after, the top 1 to 3% in your particular field, pretty much your whole life you have been treated like a brain on a stick, from the time that you were little all the way up through college and then beyond in graduate school. And they would tend to adopt things that answered the bigger ultimate questions without necessarily investigating them with the same kind of rigor that they would in the area of specificity that they were studying. And so my friend Ken was not really into apologetics. He's just a good man. He was a kind of just a business guy, and so he could have just common sense questions, which is often a good translator between me and them, and vice versa. But we would get into these conversations, and you'd ask a very, what would be a kind of a banal question, and you would realize they have not thought this question through. And that's what was fascinating to me, to live a life in a way where you're so brilliant and you are so intelligent, but but not necessarily fearful, but not thoughtful, maybe about the bigger questions of existence and what it means to live and exist and be in this world. And so for me, that was a great early education. I was at that point becoming also a kind of serving in the church that I got saved in. And so it sent me on a particular trajectory that I thought I was going to end up doing some graduate studies in bioethics from that experience, and I ended up not going that route, planted a church instead. But it's amazing. It's amazing when you have Christians that inhabit spaces like that are thinking not only in their area of specialty, like Dave is, and you need to be good, because the truth is when you go to a neurosurgeon, it'd be helpful if he's Christian, but what you want is what? The best neurosurgeon. How amazing is it that someone could be simultaneously a bit of an expert in their field while understanding that there are bigger questions at play, and also to see the interconnectedness of all of these questions. So when we're talking about the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, all these other things, argument from consciousness, the reason why we're doing that is many of these things are all interconnected. One of the questions of philosophers that they've struggled with for many years is which should be the most privileged branch of philosophy that you should study. So kind of the three main branches would be epistemology, study of knowing, metaphysics, study of being, and then ethics. And then under that would be a sub-branch maybe of aesthetics and things like that. So which is the most important? Is it how we know what we know? Is it what does it mean to be and exist? Or is it questions of ethics? I'd love to just run this experiment, because I've run this experiment a few dozen times. I'd love to hear what you think. Which do you think is the most important branch of philosophy to study? Brother?
Epistemology, because if you don't know what you know, what do you know?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Epistemology. What else? It's kind of hard to be ethical if you can't learn anything and you don't know why you know. You have no confidence in the knowledge that you've acquired. Yeah, what else? Any other answers? Y'all just think it's a trap. I'm not answering anything, mister. Let me tell you why I asked this question. It's a question that's asked. It's not a question necessarily that's asked. It's an argument that's made within departments of philosophy. And depending upon your area of specialty, you're going to argue strenuously for that particular branch of philosophy as the ultimate branch of philosophy. What is fascinating, if you are able, and you've learned anything even at a kind of philosophy 101 level, to back out and recognize that all of these are 100% radically interconnected. And you can't have one without the other. So Dave, his instinct is right, that how can you ask questions of being if you're not even sure that you can believe what you know? How can you ask questions of ethics if you're not even sure that what you've learned to be ethical is in fact ethical? But the same argument could be made in reverse. How can you be ethical? Maybe I should say, how could you assume that what you've learned is the right knowledge if it's disconnected from ethical questions? So maybe you're a mad scientist that learns things but uses it for harm. Or why you exist and what you're here for and the purpose of your existence and the big questions behind metaphysical questions. That it just seems like we humans have been wired to ask for thousands of years. And we require answers. The metaphysical questions that we maybe answer just naturally because we have little throwaway cliches, that are questions that actually sustain us when hard things happen in our life. Is the world set against you, or is there some other purpose to your existence? And what does it all mean? And why are you here? And these things are all radically interconnected, is my point. And so when we talk about these arguments and we're looking at different angles by which we are approaching the question of the existence of God, we're not doing it just to have smart arguments. We're doing it because we're essentially saying a life lived would be a life lived well thinking about the purpose and nature of our existence. To apply these things that we're learning in an ethical way, to understand the purpose for which we exist, and to on some level have justification and confidence that what we're learning is actually true truth and not something different. So, why did I say all of that? Because we're going to talk about the psychology of unbelief tonight. And I'm going to start with a quote from a famous French chemist, microbiologist, who discovered the principles of vaccination and pasteurization. His name is Louis Pasteur. And he said this, and I think this is an important quote. Listen carefully to what he says. The greatest derangement of the mind is to believe in something because one wishes it to be so. The greatest derangement of the mind is to believe something because one wishes it to be so. What he's arguing is that what one comes to believe should be justifiable. It should be justifiable and not just merely wish fulfillment. Now, I'm going to offer a contradictory quote, or it seems at the first pass contradictory, by C.S. Lewis, someone I love very much because I quote him all the time. C.S. Lewis says this, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world satisfies, I've run the experiment through it's a book of Ecclesiastes on loop. I've run the experiment over and over. I've tried money, I've tried sex, I've tried power, I've tried aesthetics, I've tried food, I've tried wine, I've tried everything. And it seems there's something so deep in my desires that nothing in this world satisfies. His argument is that's an indicator and a probable explanation that you are built for something different than what you're experiencing in the here and now. Now, these statements appear diametrically opposed. One is saying that we should trust in something because it's true, not merely because we wish for it to be true. And another is saying that there are desires that are so intrinsic, so deep in our longing as humans, that this is an indicator that this thing must in some way exist, which is why we seem hopelessly and magnetically drawn to something greater than what we experience in our lives. And I think this introduces us, it maybe opens a door to the complexity and psychology of both belief and unbelief. Now we're going to get into discussing, as I said, more about epistemology and science next week, but I want to start first with an examination of how it is, at least the psychological reasons for how we might come to believe or reject the same evidence when presented to us. So I want to look at first some reasons for unbelief, no matter how sound the arguments are. And what I love about Jesus is he often does this by telling stories, doesn't he? Jesus is the best teacher in the world. I am so drawn to him just as a person. But I hope when you come on Sunday, you get something of my love and affection for him. He blows my mind. I have been learning about him, attempting to the best of my abilities to follow him now for a good 26 years. And I am more and more smitten by him. And I can't help it. There is just something about him that is just magnetic. I don't know what it is. And I often think, it's maybe, is it the way that he teaches? Is it what he teaches? I think it's all those things. There is something amazing about the way Jesus teaches, the way he interacts and engages people. I really want to encourage you as folks interested in apologetics, never to detach your learning about theological concepts, especially apologetic concepts, from the person and work of Jesus. Like that needs to be your anchor in many ways to reality. But when I watch Jesus interact with people, when I watch him talk to people, he's just masterful. He's absolutely masterful. He, on this subject, he tells, there's many stories that he tells, but he tells one very fascinating story, which can be found in Luke chapter 16. I'm going to read it to you, but if you have a Bible, I would love for you to open it up, just because I think it's helpful to see Jesus' perspective in what we're discussing. In Luke 16, verse 19, it says this. I'll give you a moment to get there. Luke 16, verse 19. Let me know when you guys are there. Everybody there? Cool. He says, now remember, this is a parable. This is a story that Jesus is telling. I wouldn't even necessarily call it a parable. Well, it's probably a parable. It's definitely a story that he's telling. He says, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores. Not the same Lazarus that he rose from the dead. It's just a story he's telling. Isn't it funny that he tells a story and he uses his friend's name in here? And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, this rich man lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his, oh, I cut out a section here.
Finger in water.
Yeah,
Cool my tongue. For I am in anguish in this flame.
yeah.
Let me know whenever you need me. You can
Back to verse 25. So he's basically asking Abraham to tell Lazarus, the poor man, to take his finger and dip it in some water because he's thirsting. And in verse 25 it says, but Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. Verse 27, and he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham. But if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Jesus says, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. If they don't hear Moses and the prophets, if they won't hear the Pentateuch, then it doesn't matter even if someone rises from the dead. They won't believe. They won't hear from him. Now this parable works on, just as a good story, kind of works on multiple levels, doesn't it? It offers a warning to the rich who, in their excess, refuse to treat a fellow human made in God's image with dignity and respect by merely offering him something to eat from his excess. Also, he refuses to help him with his physical infirmity. It also teaches us of kind of the folly of becoming rich in all things the world has to offer, but while remaining impoverished to the things of God. It gives us little hints of life extending beyond our physical death and the justice which will attend those who refuse to love God or live in his ways. And it likewise shows us something quite shocking, that we may fail to seek God, not because it can't be found, and not because there isn't sufficient evidence, but because evidence, no matter how incredible or credible or compelling, cannot cause a heart set upon itself to turn outward towards its maker. That's Jesus' argument. I mean, that's how he ends this argument. And for Jesus to finish the parable by essentially saying, if they don't receive the words I've spoken, neither will they be convinced of someone rising from the dead. He's using this fictional character Lazarus as a resurrection figure, but it's clear he is speaking of his own impending death and resurrection. It is very clear what he's doing. And the infinite capacity for skepticism that we humans possess. And we tend to find what we're looking for because we only look for what we want to find. Evidence be damned if it contradicts our deeply held beliefs. No one wants to believe this, of course, but it is true. It is true. And too often the reason for our disbelief in God isn't owing to a purely rational objection, like we'd prefer it to be. It's because belief in the God of Scripture has consequences that we're unwilling to face. To give up our bitterness, or to break off an extramarital affair, to stop cheating our company at work, to no longer live purely for our own selfish self-interest and self-indulgence, or perhaps because following Jesus might mean that we have to admit that we aren't as good of a person as we pretend to be. That and 1,000 more are varying reasons that bring fear to our hearts when provided the truth of the gospel. Dr. Scott Peck shares a story that illustrates this. One of his patients was struggling with just deep and crippling depression, and it was experiencing just this overwhelming sense of meaninglessness in her life. And the more that he learned about her story, the more that he conversed with her, he began to learn some things about her years growing up. She went to a church. She had what would be probably considered a very religious and robust belief in God. But when he began to press her and ask her why her beliefs didn't make much of a difference in helping her with her deep-seated depression and meaninglessness, she became silent. And then, almost against her will, blurted out, this is her quote, "I cannot do it. There is no room for me in that. That would be my death. I don't want to live for God. I will not. I want to live for me, for my own sake." Now, whatever you might think, I want you to know I've heard that story more times than I care to admit. And I find it heartbreaking, but simultaneously wonderfully honest. I'll tell you a story. It's a personal story. My son, who I love with a great deal, he at 26 walked away from the faith. He had we were helping to fund a church plant out of our church, and so he went over to help them with worship. And he came to me at 26, and he said that he was no longer a Christian. And I hadn't quite learned what my friends later came to teach me about the don't blink policy. You know, parents, it'd be good for you if you're young parents to learn the don't blink policy, that no matter what your kids say, just stay cool and don't blink. Don't blink if you can, don't blink. Rather than just losing it right there on the spot. It's usually not helpful for them, because then it turns the conversation around to you and your feelings, and it's not really listening to your child. And I was feeling all kinds of things inside. I'm sure it was coming out in my face. I don't have a great poker face. And I, of course, asked him, began to ask him a series of questions. Not many, but a couple. And one of them was, do you not believe that Jesus existed? Do you not believe that God is real, that the gospel's true? And he said, no, that's not it. I just don't want anybody telling me what to do. Now, inside, I'm breaking. But also, I was so grateful for his honesty to his dad that he felt comfortable enough to just tell me. And one of the things I commended him with, I don't know if I did it that night, it's probably later. I'm imagining it was later. So I was just so grateful that he didn't try to fake it. He didn't try to live his days pretending to be something that he wasn't. And the thing that I respect my son for a great deal, I look up to him in many ways, is he doesn't want to be something that he doesn't want to act like something that he's not. He wants to be consistent. And for him, he recognized that there wasn't a desire to submit to the lordship of Jesus in his life. And he needed to be truthful about that, and he wasn't going to just simply fake it. I love my son to death, and he just turned 40 this month, and so I'm praying for him. I always welcome people to pray from a boy. We have a wonderful relationship, and I enjoy him a great deal, and I'm so glad that he actually likes hanging out with an old fart like me. But that also was very illuminating for me as a pastor. It's one thing when you hear other people's kids having those conversations. You can kind of put on the pastoral voice. Oh, I'm so sorry. Give them some good and comforting words about God's sovereignty their stories in the Lord's hands. It's a whole nother thing when it's your own child. And it makes you face things, face realities that maybe you don't necessarily want to face. One of those realities is the utter complexity of belief. And that there are 100 things that are going on in someone. And that we are always, because we're meaning makers and we want to be reasonable creatures. We don't do well with dissonance, internal dissonance. We want things to kind of just make sense to us. We like to find causes, and so we sometimes slip into oversimplification and reductionism just to get to a cause so we can make ourselves better. And what I'm suggesting tonight is that unbelief is a lot more complex than that. Now, there's things that you could say biblically about it that I think are absolutely true, but unbelief is often very complex. I want to also just maybe take a moment and as a throwaway comment here, I want to say that unbelief is not the same thing as doubts. Are any of you here troubled at times by the doubts that you find in your heart about whether or not the thing that we're doing is even true? Let me go first. I really don't know if it's possible not to. There's so many things going on inside of us. There's still sanctification happening. There's still all kinds of junk in our hearts and minds and bad habits we've learned, and hearts that aren't completely, fully won over. We're not terribly consistent in how we live our lives. We often have misaligned affections, distorted thoughts and desires, and all of that can be quite troubling. And usually what it does is it creates gaps and disconnections that can be breeding grounds for doubt. But I want to be clear that that's normal. Can you just hear that from me tonight? That's normal. Now, I'm not holding up doubt as a virtue. Please also don't hear me that I'm saying, because we want to be kind of like, we're going to act like we're from Seattle. Man, it's just so cool I'll just doubt everything. And, I'm not suggesting that. What I am saying is, that's part of the normal experience of following Jesus. I mean, in Matthew 28, Jesus has his disciples together. Just understand the scene. Jesus is risen from the dead. They have either seen and bore witness to his crucifixion, or they are next to someone that has first-eye accounts. Everybody knows what happened to Jesus. Now everyone knows that Jesus is alive, and they're seeing him with their own eyes. And he has these disciples that he pulls together, and he's in his resurrected state, and he's going to give them a commission. And before he does, he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And he issues this command, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded. I'm going to be with you the entire time, though. You're not going to be alone. But earlier in the text, before he issues the commands, it says that some believed and some doubted. He's risen from the dead. Right? I mean, you'd think, wouldn't you? That like with that kind of evidence, it would... Do you ever read the Old Testament and just go, come on, if I saw that happen, if I saw the Red Sea split in half, and we like walked through it, and then I turn around and Pharaoh's army just whoosh, just gets flushed, I would never doubt the living God again. If I were Moses, if a burning bush spoke to me, either one thing is going on or another, but I would never doubt again. I would never doubt again. And it's just simply not true. It's not true. Which gives me incredible comfort on one level, that doubt is a part of the human experience. It's part of being a disciple of Jesus. It's part of experiencing a life in which we are still yet to be completed. We're a work in process. We're still a work in process. So why do I say that? I say that because I think sometimes in the church, when we use the word doubt, we think it's synonymous with unbelief. What we're not talking about is an unbelief that does not believe who Jesus is or what Jesus accomplished. We're talking about doubts. And doubts, they come and they go. And there's seasons where they feel stronger than others. And that's not the same thing as unbelief. Unbelief is where we essentially say, I don't want anything to do with you, and your offer for a better life through the work and person of Jesus, I'm not interested in. It's an unwillingness as much as it is a cognitive thing that's happening. But it is, I will tell you as a parent, it is heartbreaking. A heart that is comfortable keeping God at a distance, making kind of a concept or an idea while refusing to surrender our lives at the very core of who we are is a life that's going to feel unsustainable if we're kind of faking it. It's this issue of unbelief is also why we keep returning back to Romans 1, and we're going to do that again here. Maybe I'll have you all turn there. If you could turn to Romans 1. I only had it on the screen a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's good for us to look at it. Maybe you can bookmark it in your brain, or you can, if it's your Bible and not one you're borrowing, you can mark it on your own. But I think it's helpful as we consider some of what's going on underneath our unwillingness to yield to the truth of who Jesus is and what he's done. Romans 1:17 says this. It's a bit of an explanation, and a good one. It says in verse 17 of Romans 1, "For the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." Here it is. "Who, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth." They push it down. It's not that the truth is not there. It's not that the truth is not accessible. They suppress it. In a state of unrighteousness, they suppress it. He goes on to say, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." Verse 22, "Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." And we're still doing that. We're still doing that. Paul's argument is that we humans are not neutral beings objectively measuring evidence for God's existence. Rather, we're beings who have in our natural state chosen to ignore, according to Paul, the evidence of God's existence by, as verse 18 tells us, suppressing truth and unrighteousness. Now, being unrighteous here just simply means being out of step, out of alignment with God. We're no longer rightly related to him. So we make decisions out of our heart that is unrightly related to him, or unrighteous. We suppress truth in our unrightly related state with God. Paul even goes on to say in 2 Corinthians 4:4 that this is the reason for our blindness. He says in verse 4 of 2 Corinthians 4, "The God of this world has blinded the minds," listen carefully, "the God of this world," this is a frightening passage, by the way, "the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." The God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. We cannot, nor will we look at spiritual reality that we face. We can't see it because we're blind to it. We're both willfully and naturally blind to it. It's why we won't face even moral realities in truth. There's something fundamentally off and unrightly related. And it's one of the perplexing problems that historians face when they're looking at even something like German society during Hitler's rise and reign. The question is, how could it possibly be that an entire country would collectively willingly be blind to the unbelievable atrocities being perpetuated upon the Jews? How is that even possible? And one answer at a simple level, but I think it's an accurate level, is because they didn't want to see it. They didn't want to see it. And these things were fair, the things that were going on in their country were fairly well known among the Germans. It's a poor argument to say historically that nobody knew it was happening. They may not have known all the details of Nuremberg and all that, but they knew what was going on. They saw it with their own eyes. Their once friends, these store owners that they would frequent, their neighbors were being marked and ripped from their families, their businesses closed, their homes confiscated, and their bodies savaged. One historian commenting on this period of history says, it isn't that they didn't know, it's that they would not know. They would not know because they didn't want to know. Because they didn't want to know. Now, it's just so easy for us to make judgments, isn't it? I mean, again, I want to detach it from this situation because this is hot. But let me just use the Old Testament. And this is something that I regularly face. Reading the Old Testament stories, especially Judges, and you're just like, what? Like at some point you go, come on, are you kidding? Are you kidding me? You're joking, right? I mean, have you not seen this cycle? Why do you keep doing this? You are like the dog that returns to its vomit. You're like the fool that returns to its folly. And you get in trouble, and then God brings judgment, and then you're, oh no, and you hate the experience, and so you cry out, and then God sends someone to save you and pull you out of that nonsense, and then you're out of it, and you're out of it for 5 minutes, and you're back in the same place again. Have any of you seen that video of the guy that's walking the sheep? And it's just, you guys got to look this up. It is what pastoring is. He's walking this sheep, and the sheep just gets super excited, and it leaps, and it falls, and it gets stuck in a ditch. Just like up to its shoulders, completely stuck, can't move. It's freaked out. So the guy he has to get down. He's like, and he's a big fat sheep, and he's like, he lifts. I'm making weird noises with my throat. I'm sorry. And he gets this dumb sheep out, and the stupid thing leaps twice and lands right back in it again. You're like, this was text to be like, looks like we're having lamb tonight. But that's us. I mean, that's us. And it is a weird experience to read the Bible and have that frustration well up inside of you where you're just like, I just don't understand. Until, you look at yourself in the mirror and say, oh, I perfectly understand. I perfectly understand. There are things going on that are complex, that are happening spiritually. There's things happening within our own world of desires and our own thoughts, our own longings, our own loves, that can too often be direct competitors to a better life that Jesus offers, a life lived in rest, joy and truth, free. And we just would rather go back into slavery like our forebears, Israel. Those who witnessed Jesus raised from the dead, who had been in the tomb, those who witnessed Lazarus being raised from the dead, someone who had been in the tomb for 4 days, were eyewitnesses of the account. Now I'm talking about the Lazarus that Jesus actually rose from the dead, in case there's confusion. And yet, when many came to the Jewish religious leaders to report what they saw, you would have thought maybe their inclination would have been, is this the Messiah, the long-awaited, promised Messiah that we've all been waiting for? And maybe they would have wanted to investigate, but instead, the fear of the loss of their power, the fear of the loss of their favor and protection that they got from Rome, as hard as that pill was to swallow, led to willful blindness. Fear leads to blindness. Fear of the unknown, the fear of results that that truth may bring. And this is most certainly true when it comes to believing in God. And listen, there's a lot of things going on in this issue of willful blindness. It isn't reserved, by the way, for the uneducated or the religious or the unsophisticated or the uncultured. This is a problem that is common to all of us, especially, by the way, as I told you my story earlier, those with grants, where their reputation, their academic tenure, and peer approval are on the line. We might think that because someone puts a lab coat on, that now makes them a neutral party. It's not so. There is no neutrality. No such thing. One example of this comes from an observation that a well-known, prominent astronomer named Robert Jastrow, he was a PhD from Columbia. He worked for years with NASA, and then he went on to be a professor at Dartmouth. He was an agnostic. He was even when he wrote the book. I don't know if he is today. He might not even be alive today. But he describes this issue that he sees among the scientific community. And he wrote a book called God and the Astronomers. It's a very long quote, so we're going to have multiple slides, but I wanted to give it to you in case you guys want to take pictures of it. Maybe even encourage you to go read the book. He says, scientists have no proof that life was not the result of an act of creation, but they are driven, listen to the language, they are driven by the nature of their profession, this is religious language, to seek explanations for the origin of life that lie within the boundaries of natural law. They ask themselves, how did life arise out of inanimate matter? And what is the probability of that happening? And to their chagrin, they have no clear-cut answer because chemists have never succeeded in reproducing nature's experiments on the creation of life out of non-living material. He goes on to say, now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. This is crazy, by the way, that an agnostic is saying this. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply at a definitive moment in time in a flash of light and energy. Some scientists are happy with the idea that the world began this way. He goes on to say, theologians generally are delighted with the proof that the universe had a beginning, but astronomers are curiously upset. Their reactions provide an interesting demonstration of the response of the scientific mind, supposedly a very objective mind, when evidence uncovered by science itself leads to a conflict with the articles of faith in our profession. It turns out that the scientist behaves the way the rest of us do when our beliefs are in conflict with the evidence. We become irritated and we pretend the conflict does not exist, or we paper it over with meaningless phrases. He goes on to say, there is a strange ring of feeling and emotion in these reactions of scientists to evidence that the universe had a sudden beginning. They come from the heart, whereas you would expect the judgments to come from the brain. Why? I think the part of the answer is that scientists cannot bear the thought of a natural phenomenon which cannot be explained even with unlimited time and money. There is a kind of religion in science. It is the religion of a person who believes there is order and harmony in the universe. Every event can be explained in a rational way as a product of some previous event. Every effect must have its cause, therefore no first cause. This religious faith, listen to what he says. This is scandalous. This religious faith of the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid, and as a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. And when that happens, the scientist has lost control. He finishes with this. Consider the enormity of the problem. Science has proven that the universe exploded into being at a certain moment. It asks, what cause produced this effect? Who or what put the matter and energy into the universe? Was the universe created out of nothing, or was it gathered together out of pre-existing materials? And science cannot answer these questions. Why do I offer that very long quote? It isn't to dunk on scientists that disbelieve in what we believe. That's not the purpose. It's to show something powerful. And again, as I've been saying, I think there are moments for all of us. You know, we've talked a little bit about our own doubts. There's moments of honesty when we just tell the truth, not only for religious folk, but also for non-religious folk, where what we want to be true, what we presuppose to be true, is not lining up with our experiences. And I love that there's these honest insights into the mind of the scientists and the scientific community. I've experienced this firsthand, but I love it when scientists are honest about that, when they can look and reflect truthfully at what's happening. But I want you to know this language. He calls this the religious faith of the scientist. It's a belief that these things must be, and when experiments don't go the way that they desire. Now look, this is something, not only do I know firsthand, this is something that will get you in trouble. And I know this for a fact because I'm just going to say that. I'm not going to tell you how I know. It is very possible to desire something different than what your experiments give you. And that very well may put your career on the line. It may put your grant in danger. It may mean that paper that you were about to publish, maybe your first paper, finally you're going to get published, and now it's just all shot. And so what you do is you fudge the numbers. You play games. You make the data say something different than what the data actually says. What is that? That's the human condition. And we're all infected with it. We're all infected with it. I'm going to finish with this quote. And it's just a quote that I gave the first week, but I love it. Again, if you weren't here, I think it's important for you to hear. It's from Professor of Law and Philosophy at NYU. I don't think he's there anymore, Thomas Nagel. So he honestly assesses this problem of willful disbelief. He says, I speak from experience. Being strongly subject to this fear myself, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition, and that it is responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. One of the tendencies it supports is the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about human life, including everything about the human mind. This is a somewhat ridiculous situation. It is just as irrational to be influenced in one's beliefs by the hope that God does not exist as by the hope that God does exist. He says it is just as irrational to be influenced by beliefs in the hope that God doesn't exist as it is, because he's an atheist, by the hope that God does exist. And he just admitted that he's one of them. I'm one of them that I hope God doesn't exist. So, there's more here, but I'm going to stop. And I want to just hear your thoughts, questions, ideas. Anything strike you strange? And whoever has the mic, is that you, Dave? Would you be kind enough to Yes. Anything that struck you about the idea of the differentiating between doubt and unbelief, or the complexity of unbelief, or maybe some of the psychological things that attend our unbelief? Yes, Derek. I'm going to give you the mic so folks can hear.
Okay, you're in.
I appreciated you really highlighting the doubt is normal. It's not a virtue, it's not cool, but it's normal. I think that's a great bridge for the unbeliever in apologetics and engaging with people who don't believe, who have, or just have legitimate doubts. You can meet them there. You know, that's a great common ground of the, hey, yeah, there's some challenges here, right? Like there's some good questions to ask. It's okay to just have that wrestle in your heart. And then also it begs you to go to the cross, like for the unbeliever and for the believer who struggles. For myself, like it demands, like it leads me right to the cross of I need Jesus, I need help, I need redemption, I need forgiveness, I need, hope right now. So I just, and And I wrestle with that. So, again, highlighting that in light of all this. And one more small thing to make a personal note of the way you're describing how we just don't want these things to be this way. I have a personal thing of where if I want to be presented a certain way, if I want to look a certain way, be known as a certain type of person, and somebody's calling out my sin or somebody is not viewing me the way I want to be seen or things go wrong, like I'm frustrated, right? Like I'm irritated at that, and I'm mad rather than being humbled, rather than being, like, again, going to the Lord and the truth, the subjective truth that is, or objective truth that is just out there of what he says.
That's good, brother. That's good. Yeah, man, that's good wisdom. I do think that we've been trying to say this each week, but our disposition and how we have these conversations are really important. And I think part of the challenge with how Christians have learned to communicate with others outside maybe the faith is so adversarial on one level that it just smacks of self-righteousness and it shuts down the conversation. Rather than what you're suggesting, which I think is right, is if it's true that the same struggles that this person has, I have as well. Like, look, when I sin, no one's holding a gun to my head. I'm not being forced to do it against my will. That thing, whatever it is, seems more delightful and more attractive and more beautiful and more magnetic to me than Jesus. And so when someone doesn't want Jesus, I can say with all sincerity and honesty, I know what that's like. Now that may not be true about overall, like what I think or believe, but there are moments when that most definitely is true. And if I remember that, then suddenly I am someone walking next to them, not someone standing in front of them, talking down to them, not understanding why they don't get it, when the fact of the matter is I don't get it. Back to our previous point about like reading about the stories about the Israelites. It's so frustrating for us until we remember ourselves. And then suddenly when you remember yourself, you consider your own inconsistencies, you consider your own desperate need for God's grace, and that God not only provides it, but provides it in abundance to a degree that he actually can provide some level of security and confidence that we are really loved, we really are forgiven all the way, that there's nothing that we can do to make him love us more, and there's nothing that we can do to make him love us less, that he loves us in the person of his Son. And because of that, I can rest in that reality. Makes me a more honest person to tell the truth about my own struggles. And we appreciate that when someone's preaching and they do that, but we should do that. We should just all do that. And it shouldn't be a shtick, and it shouldn't be a thing that we learn, some manipulative form of communication where we put on a different voice. I'm a struggler too, It should be real to be able to say, I understand. I understand where you're at. I know exactly what that feels like. They're like, well, yeah, but that was 30 years ago when you're not a Christian. Oh, no, that was like 5 minutes ago. Yeah. Let me tell you about the argument I just got in with my wife. I totally didn't do anything that Jesus told me to do. I wanted my way. I wanted to be respected. I wanted to be understood, whatever it was. I was willing to say no to Jesus and say yes to myself because I wanted it. So I know what it's like. I'm not talking with you as someone that I'm in the same boat. The difference is I know a guy. Like I know a guy. And there is something so powerful about that when we're sharing our faith with others. Because what we have is we have resources in the midst of all the crazy of our life, in the midst of all the attending, minefield of disappointment and pain and suffering and loss that we're going to experience over a whole lifetime. We have resources that others maybe don't have. And there's a stabilizing effect that offers us and gives to us. That we can suffer like Paul calls us to, and yet rejoice. Like that's such a weird thing. How do you suffer and rejoice at the same time? It is possible. I've experienced it. Like, I didn't do anything to make it happen, but I have experienced suffering and yet rejoicing because I don't suffer alone. We're not, as the New Testament teaches, we're not like the world that grieves without God. We have something that isn't to be pridefully used as a weapon to bludgeon other people, but it's to actually take on a cruciformity to it, even in our words, that we walk the path of Jesus and that we commend Christ in how we speak to other people. And that as we offer the gospel to them, we're offering something to them that we are in desperate need of in that moment. And if we can remember that truth and that reality, then suddenly it just changes even our approach to apologetics, doesn't it? Changes how we wrestle with these things and how we talk about these things. So that's why I was commending to you earlier. You got to keep looking at Jesus. Like, he's the interpretive key. He says this in Luke 24. He's the interpretive key to the whole thing. Like, without Jesus, you don't really understand the sacrificial system, the temple, the tabernacle, the prophets, the priests, the king. You don't understand any of that. Jesus tells us in Luke 24 that all of that's about me. It's all about me. The only way to understand history is to understand it through me. And without me, it is a cacophony of terror and suffering. Well, I would also add one thing. C.S. Lewis is right. I can't remember the quote exactly, but I'll give you a rough gist of it. He talks about, he's not speaking as skepticism as something that's inherently bad, but what he's saying is the point of skepticism is to get through it. To say, I see through something, the point of saying, I see through something that's kind of weak is to see the solid thing on the other side. So to be skeptical, really, the point of skepticism is to be skeptical of weak things that really are kind of fallacious or weak or don't make sense, to see something solid on the other side. His argument, though, is for those that pride themselves in being a skeptic, which was me prior to becoming a Christian, who take it as almost an identity, a badge of honor. I'm a skeptic, I don't believe anything. He said, that's like living in a completely opaque world where he says seeing through everything is the same thing as never seeing. To see through everything is the same thing as being blind. Because to see through something, to see the garden through your window, the point of seeing through the window is to see the garden. But to see through the garden and through this and through everything has got this, we have an infinite capacity as humans to just brush off, whatever's presented to us because of this complex psychology of unbelief that's happening inside of us. We can just dismiss anything. Look, Jesus is saying you could dismiss the guy that was raised from the dead. Even if they see it with their own eyes, they can still go, I don't believe it. I had a bad burrito. I'm upset today, and so I think it's a hallucination. You can write off anything. You can experience something, see something, have it evidenced, have eyewitnesses, and you can still choose to not believe it. Guys, we live in a day, we don't trust anything that actually happened anymore. We don't trust news sources. We don't trust authority figures. We don't trust eyewitness accounts if they don't agree with us. We don't believe anything. Is there something good about not accepting weak half-truths? Yes. But if that's the condition that creates an identity, then in effect you can't see. Or worse yet, maybe the worst condition today would be you would only see what you want. And I don't know which is worse, seeing through everything and therefore not seeing, or seeing only what you want. All right, let's do one more. Yes, we'll do two more. Derek, would you be kind enough to bring that to? Yes, thank you.
I was just going to share something because it's been so helpful for me in some of these conversations I've had. So I think a lot of people that don't believe just automatically assume that people who do believe, they just have faith and they don't think. So if I'm a person who does think and I have doubts, then I can't be in that camp. I have to be over here on the outside. So the story that helps me the most with them is this. Jesus said that the best man that ever lived, the best man ever born of a woman, which pretty much everybody until maybe recently, just kidding, was John the Baptist, right? So John the Baptist was in prison. And while he's in prison, what does he do? He starts to doubt. So he sends his guys, and he goes, hey, you know what? Go find that guy and ask him if he's the one or if we're supposed to be waiting on someone else. And so when I tell these people, I go, now what would you expect Jesus to say when those guys come up and say, hey, are you the one? Or are we waiting on someone else? I said, me, as a Catholic when I was raised young, I'd expect Jesus to say, shame on you. You need more faith. You should go read your Bible. Shame on you, right? That's what those people are feeling too. But that is not what Jesus says. Jesus says, you go back and tell John, the lame are made to walk, the dead are raised, and so forth. In other words, you go tell John what you see here. You go tell John what the evidence is. So Jesus himself says, have your doubts, and allow those doubts to cause you to look at the evidence, and that will draw you to him. And I have found that to be very helpful. So to both of your points, I thought that was really good.
It's awesome. Jim, thank you very much. Right behind you.
I mean, that kind of touches on what I was going to ask, but throughout a lot of this, I mean, I feel like we've gotten a good, or at least I've gotten a really good kind of like perspective and outlook of the psychology of unbelief, especially for spiritually unregenerate people. And so I think I have like a better grasp on kind of how to address and kind of like deal with and sympathize and love those type of people. Now, kind of with addressing spiritually regenerate brothers and spiritually regenerate self. Now, whenever unbelief, not unbelief as in like a lack of, like complete lack of faith, but whenever unbelief enters that picture, and now that we have those kind of new spiritual faculties given to us, how do we kind of like reconcile with those types of unbeliefs? Because I feel like that might be a little bit of a different dynamic kind of going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I don't want to be too hard on making distinctions. Distinctions are helpful, but they break down. So, this idea of doubt and unbelief, I'm drawing distinctions to help us not arrive in categories or not assume one equals the other. But clearly there's a biblical text that says, I believe, help my unbelief. So there is an element of weakness in us. And I don't say that like, I hope what you guys hear from me is I am not a fan of worm theology. You know what I mean? I'm not a fan of like, I think this was a product of post-Enlightenment theology where man had puffed himself up so much that he became the center of all things instead of God. And so I think a lot of the writers during that period of history were writing to seriously humble, prideful man. And I don't think that's gone away. I think the problem with only looking at us as worms is it isn't actually true anthropologically. The Bible talks about us as being far more than just nothing. And in fact, it never speaks us as nothing. And so I say that because I think it's important that we embrace how God sees us, how God talks about us, what his opinion of us is. We're never a zero. We're never an animal. Like that's just never the case. Like even in an unregenerate state, we're never those things because we are stamped, made in the image of God. And so why do I say that? Because I think in those moments, the temptation, if you subscribe to a kind of worm theology, is to just blister yourself with a kind of form of negativity that may not be terribly accurate as to who you are. You're right. As a believer, there is something different going on. Like when we sin or when we doubt, we do so in a position of favor. That's a strange thing, isn't it? Like even when I sin in a position of favor. I'm still the Lord's. And I'm not rejected by him. And I think people need to hear that again and again and again so that, look, as doubts come, as there are moments where, we are experiencing a sense of unbelief. Or I think reminding ourselves and being reminded by others around us who we are is extraordinarily helpful, who we are specifically in Christ. But then also just like looking at the examples of just being able to say something like Jim used with John the Baptist. I mean, notice where Jim takes his doubt is to Jesus. I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. The weakness provides an opportunity of need. And that need then gets directed to the only lightning rod that can ground all that nervous, frenetic, anxious energy, who's Christ. He's a lightning rod to all of our crazy, whatever it might be, sin, doubt, intellectual troubles, emotional problems. He's the ground for our crazy. He's the one that kind of grounds that out. And I think if we don't hear that, not only is that permitted, but encouraged in the Bible, I think what we'll do is we'll unfortunately shift down to this kind of, I'm a degenerate, I'm only dirt, I'm gum on the bottom of the worst person's shoe. And it's just, if you believe that, that's a whole conversation. But do you really believe that? Or is it just something you think you're supposed to say to yourself to make yourself feel terrible? It actually ends up becoming, this might be provocative to say, but it ends up becoming kind of a way to actually avoid what you're experiencing and feeling, a way to actually avoid Jesus. There are times when we sin or when we doubt that we foolishly forget that we are still in a position of privilege. And so what we do is we play this mental exercise. We go, well, I've done this before, and man, I'm just going to have to flog myself more this time. Like, I don't want to go to Jesus yet because I want to make sure I'm sincere. And so you create the distance between yourself and God because you're like, I don't think I'm sincere. What do I need to be sincere? Whip, 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 whip. And you're like, you stay away from the Lord. I don't want to go to him. I'm dirt. I'm nothing. I don't deserve his love. I don't deserve his grace. I don't deserve his favor. And I just think that that's just a way to avoid the one who says, hey, why don't you just fall into my arms? I'm not asking you to do anything, but to just fall then. If all you can do is fall, to just fall forward. I don't need you to hold yourself back from me, to show me that you're sincere this time. I just need you to fall in my arms. And I think we don't know that. I think we know that, but I think we don't know that. And how can I say that? Because why is it that everybody struggles with that? And if we knew it, we would do it. But we don't, so we don't. And I think that's something that takes time. I think it's an art of preaching the gospel to yourself on some level. I think it's why you need a community of brothers and sisters around you that can help you in that way. I think it's why we need to have honest conversations with our spouses about how we tend to law each other. This is a very unsophisticated way of saying it, but we should all over each other. I know that's bad. It's an AA saying, where you just tell people what they should do rather than like bringing grace and the gospel to them. And we got to help each other be a community where we normalize that these things are going to happen, and then they are happening. And then when you normalize it and you end up building a kind of emotional and spiritual resilience because other people around you are modeling what it looks like to struggle in the same way, and when you're being reminded of who you are in Christ and what Christ has done for you, it provides a freedom, a soil of freedom that you can grow in. You can just grow in, because if it's true that he really does accept you, you can confess anything, and who cares? That's what we were talking about on Sunday. Like, if it's true that he loves you all the way, you are completely righteous in his Son. If that's true, then you can confess anything. And if we just normalize that, if we normalize, man, I'm really struggling with doubts, or I'm really struggling with fear, I'm really struggling with bitterness or sin or lust or whatever it is, I'm really struggling. And we can just be a community that is a community that just helps fellow strugglers. Man, that's the church I want to belong to. I mean, that's the church I belong to. And I want that to be so desperately for our church, what it feels like. There's things that you say as a church that you're about, and then there's the reality. And that's what I want our church to feel like when someone walks in our church. I don't care where you are or what's going on. These are people that know what it means to be a sinner and know what it means to be a saint, saved by the grace of Jesus. And we bank on that. That's all we bank on. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
8:29 on the button. Any more? Did I see a hand go up or no? Was that baby duty back there? Okay. Hey, thank you guys for coming out if you have babies. Thank you for doing that. I know that's not an easy thing to do. And we didn't provide childcare for this. Thank you for bringing the little ones. Plus, I'm yet to be a grandparent, so even better for me. Even better for me. All right, can I pray for you guys, and then we'll get on out of here. Lord, thank you. You're gracious to us. something we say a lot. But it's good to slow down and remember what that means. Keep us from just being smart or learning new tricks. Help us to be people that yield to the Spirit, that walk in the Spirit, that display fruits of the Spirit in all that we do. The way we talk to each other, the way that we see fellow humans and fellow siblings in Christ. Help us to be a place that is this weird combination of grace and truth that was most clearly exhibited in the person of Jesus. Help us to become more and more by the work of the Spirit and Word like Him. So thanks tonight for teaching us. We pray that the stuff that we would learn would be helpful and most importantly would help us to love you more and to love our neighbor more. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Have a good night, you guys. Thanks for coming out.